medieval mace was a useless weapon. It was purely ceremonial. Is that true? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now recently I was looking at a couple of sources which I wasn't actually looking for this, but they featured maces. I was like, aha, my old friend the mace. So regular viewers of this channel will know I've done a number of videos, not that long ago in fact, looking at the medieval mace. So I'm not going to go into great depth here, other than to say when I did videos on maces, I initially talked about the fact that these top-heavy bludgeoning instruments were particularly suited to fighting in armour. And my friend Dequitem came back with that and said, you know, maces aren't actually very good in armour. And I think we have to separate some things here. First of all, there's different maces. Secondly, there's different armours, and that's very, very important. But also there's the nature of the fighting. Okay, what type of fighting are we looking at? Are we looking at simulated combat? Are we looking at one-on-one sport combat? Are we looking at melees? Are we looking at fights between soldiers with varying equipment? But here is one of the things that came up repeatedly, is a lot of people said, oh Matt, the mace is purely ceremonial. And I actually thought, well look, I'm always willing to listen to new theories, and I try not to be one of those people who goes further and further down the rabbit hole of trying to defend my point if there is new evidence which shows that I may have been wrong. And I'm always willing to accept that I might have been wrong. And I'm going to make a confession to you. I actually started looking at the medieval sources and I noticed that a lot of commanders are shown with maces. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated and it's not a black and white thing. So the first thing is that yes, the mace has a ceremonial purpose. If you follow our Facebook page, link down below, then you will have seen recently I put up an example of maces that look like normal fighting maces, perhaps they're a bit oversized, being held in what's very clearly a ceremonial function either side of Edward III. And I'm sure most people watching this channel, certainly a good percentage, will know that maces are still carried for ceremonial purposes today. So yes, on one hand, it is absolutely true to say that maces clearly had a ceremonial, or rather a symbolic significance. And this goes all the way back into prehistory. There are maces, there are stone-headed maces from prehistory that we're pretty sure had some type of symbolic function that we don't necessarily know the full history of because it's prehistory. But when we get into the Roman period, the Egyptian period, for example, when we look at Egyptian art, we often see maces being used to execute people, sometimes wielded by the pharaoh themselves. And this is true. Maces all the way through the ancient world and all the way through to the medieval world had a ceremonial purpose. They're somewhat similar to a general's baton. They're also somewhat similar to the scepter, carried as one of the emblems of statehood, of being the king or queen. So yes, they did have a symbolic purpose and value. Why? We don't exactly know. It goes all the way back into prehistory, was the case in Egyptian period, and was used by numerous other ancient world cultures. So we don't exactly know why. Maybe because it's just such a fundamental basic weapon. We don't know. But just because something has a symbolic significance doesn't mean it can't also be a completely valid, worthwhile weapon used on the battlefield. A perfect example of this, of course, is the thing which so much of this channel is built around: swords. Now, very clearly, I'll grab a broken sword. Maybe that's even more symbolic here. This is a broken HEMA sword. But very clearly, there's the broken end, very clearly swords were used as weapons by most cultures that invented, well, all cultures that invented them, but they also had a symbolic purpose. You know, they're carried as emblems of state, of justice, for knighting people, the symbol of justice, holding the scales with one hand and the sword with the other. It's even in our language, the sword of Damocles and all of these, being struck down by holy swords of various sorts. And all religions at some point that I'm aware of have some type of attachment or reference to swords in them, all major world religions. So swords, yes, they have a symbolic purpose, but they also have a real world purpose. Now, I'm going to put the sword back down because this is about the mace. This is also true of the mace. Just because the mace had a symbolic importance in culture doesn't mean that it wasn't also a weapon. Now, what's interesting is this source that I mentioned. It's the treatise of Walter de Mulmuet, which dates to 1326. Now, this is an English manuscript, of which there aren't a vast number of English manuscripts. A lot of manuscripts in England were actually made in France and Flanders. But this manuscript is English, and what's interesting is it shows the maces being used in a ceremonial role, but it also shows the mace being used in just a pure combat role for whacking people as an alternative to the sword, the falchion, the axe, which are the other, and spear, which are the other main weapons which appear in this treatise. So, now coming around to why was the mace possibly so important at various points? Well, this is an interesting thing. This is what we focused on before. So I'm going to try not to rehash what I went in before, but the mace has certain inherent advantages. You don't have to have edge alignment with it. It can strike in any direction from any angle. It's almost indestructible, unlike a sword, which with period steel is not that difficult to break, especially if you try and set out to do it deliberately. A mace is very difficult, perhaps even almost impossible to break. So it's an unbreakable thing. And certain late medieval and Renaissance sources talk about the mace as being a backup to the sword. So yes, you might use the sword first, but if the sword breaks or gets knocked out of your hand, you've still got this as a backup. So it's a bit like a last-ditch backup in some situations, a bit like the dagger. But more than that, I think that some people were choosing to use the mace, particularly in the age of mail, commonly known as chainmail. And in fact, we see a mace, in fact a few maces, on the Bayeux tapestry in an age where there weren't no plate armour except for helmets. They just had mail. Now, one of the great things about mail is that it actually makes swords, particularly cutting swords with not very acute tips that haven't evolved yet, not very effective. Okay, spears are still quite effective against mail at bursting the links, but if you haven't developed a thrusting sword yet, and you've only got cutting swords of the sort of late Viking era essentially, then mail is an incredibly good protection against cuts, and swords by themselves don't have a lot of percussive force, whereas axes and maces do. So my argument would be that probably the mace had a sort of glory heyday period in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, where it was very effective against mail, but in addition, also against people's heads as well. So if the person has got a decent gambeson and mail over the top, and later on a coat of plates, their body might be quite invulnerable, but donking someone on the head with a lot of percussive force might be a way of putting them out of action. And remember, this is a period when knights often wanted to take other knights hostage and ransom to get money from them. They didn't necessarily want to kill them. So they didn't necessarily want to pull out a rondel dagger and jam it up underneath their great helm. Instead, they wanted to beat the person into submission, maybe break one of their arms, break their kneecap, and knock them about in the head so that they submitted, so that they could take them for ransom. So I think potentially it is a less lethal alternative to the sword in some cases, but ironically, a perhaps more lethal alternative if you use it in certain ways in other circumstances against certain types of armour. Now, when we get into the age of plate armour, yes, plate armour, because it acts like a bridge, unlike mail, which it absorbs and prevents penetration, hopefully, but because plate armour acts like a bridge and disperses the energy, maces aren't very effective against plate armour. But here's the newsflash, folks. Let's put the mace down for a second. Plate armour, I just grab my breastplate, top half of my breastplate there. Plate armour is incredibly effective, so much so that weapons like this became pretty much universal, and even then, people happily had poleaxe combats in plate armour the whole time and didn't die. So pretty much until you got gunpowder, plate armour is usually proof against crossbows, longbows, thrown spears, swords, daggers, poleaxes, and yes, maces. So for me, arguing that maces aren't good weapons because plate armour is good against it isn't really a point of saying that the mace is a bad weapon. The fact is that all weapons are bad weapons against plate armour, because plate armour, for those who have it, and bear in mind most don't, full plate harness is incredibly hardcore and OP. So, here we go. I think fundamentally, yes, the mace had a ceremonial place in the world. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't also a valuable and useful weapon, and I think it probably had a glory period in the 12th, 13th, maybe 14th century. And yes, it was probably a lot less important in the 15th century, but you should remember by the 15th and 16th century, when maces were still around, people were still carrying them, they were still being hung off saddlebows for cavalry, for heavy cavalry. Most weapons aren't very good against plate armour. So simply saying that this isn't great against plate armour, well, what is great against plate armour? Nothing. Guns, firepower. Okay, so I hope that maybe helps give you a different perspective and a different way of looking at the mace. And actually, maces are really freaking cool, and there's no reason not to have one hanging off your saddle next time you go out for a ride. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.